On the darkest shelves of American true crime history, there are cases that don't just haunt investigators, they cling to the collective memory like shadows that refuse to fade. One of those shadows began on Christmas Eve, 1945. An unsolved mystery, a cold case that has baffled experts for nearly 8 decades, and a story woven into the dark past of a small Appalachian town. A house engulfed in flames, 5 children who vanished without a trace, and a family left behind with questions that cut deeper than grief. Were they taken, hidden, or silenced by someone who wanted the truth to burn away with the fire? Tonight, you and I step into that night, into a story haunted by secrets, contradictions, and the chilling possibility that the real crime was never the fire, but everything surrounding it. On winter nights in Fayetteville, West Virginia, the world often felt frozen in place. Snow blanketed the hills like a soft white hush, and the narrow streets of the tiny Appalachian town glowed faintly under street lamps that flickered with a tired orange warmth. Most homes rested quietly, wrapped in the stillness that comes only on the night before Christmas, when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for dawn. But on that particular night, beneath the serene blanket of cold air, something else lingered. A tension subtle enough that no one could name it, yet sharp enough that anyone paying close attention might have felt the hair on their arms rise. It was as if the silence carried a warning, as if something unseen prowled at the edges of Fayetteville's peace, searching for the perfect moment to step forward. In the center of town stood the Sodder home, a warm, bustling house filled with laughter, chores, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the kind of love only a large family truly understands. George and Jenny Sodder had built their lives here, raising 10 children under a roof that constantly echoed with stories, teasing, and the boundless energy of youth. Their life was not luxurious, but it was full. Full of effort and full of dreams. Full of hope. That hope glowed brightest in the 5 Sodder children who would later become the heart of an enduring mystery. Maurice, 14 years old, quiet but protective, the kind of boy who took responsibility seriously. Martha, 12, curious and thoughtful always, the first to offer help. Louis, temper-tied and clever with a mischievous smile. Jenny, 8, gentle and affectionate, known for her handmade cards. And little Betty, 16, cheerful and adored by every sibling. On that Christmas Eve, they had been buzzing with excitement. They stayed up later than usual, helping decorate the tree and whispering about the gifts they hoped to open in the morning. Maurice dreamed of becoming an engineer one day. He loved taking things apart to see how they worked. Martha talked endlessly about wanting to be a teacher, the kind who made every kid feel seen. Louis had plans to join his father's business when he got older, although everyone suspected he would end up doing something more adventurous. Little Jenny and Betty were too young for such big dreams, but they carried their own small joys, baking with their mother, dressing their dolls, chasing each other around the living room until everyone was laughing. Those memories, their laughter, their footsteps, their plans would later become threads for a grieving family to hold on to, long after the night stole the children away. But that night wasn't just snow and Christmas lights. Strange interactions had begun to cast shadows long before the fire ever touched the Sodder home. A few weeks earlier, an unfamiliar man had approached George on the street. His eyes were tense, darting, and his voice low as he told George that his house would go up in smoke someday, and when it did, his children would pay the price. George had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to drunk talk or small-town gossip spun out of control. Then there was the insurance salesman who had stopped by the house not long before the fire. When George declined to buy a policy, the man became oddly agitated. He warned George that refusing the deal would be a big mistake, going so far as to hint that his outspoken political views, especially his criticism of Mussolini, made him enemies. His words were sharp, almost vengeful, and when he left, the air felt heavier, as if something poisonous had been spoken into existence. And still there was more. A worker from the local power company who had appeared unannounced, insisting that the Sodder's electrical wiring was faulty and would burn the place down someday. George Disagretti's wiring had been inspected just recently. The worker's tone was strange, almost rehearsed, and he left without offering any real explanation. To Jenny, these incidents felt like warnings. To George, they were irritations, unsettling but harmless. Neither of them nor anyone in Fayetteville could have imagined how important those encounters would become. because Fayetteville was the kind of town where secrets had a way of circling quietly beneath the surface. A town small enough that everyone knew each other, but large enough that private resentments could simmer for years. Most families got along. Most, not all. George, known for his straight talk and strong opinions, had ruffled feathers more than once. As an Italian immigrant outspoken against Mussolini during a time when loyalties in immigrant communities were complicated, he had become a polarizing figure. Many respected him. Some admired him. Others despised him quietly. Jenny, softer but intuitive, often felt that certain people treated her family differently. Slight glances, whispered comments, the kind of social coldness that hints at old grudges or buried anger. Fayetteville might have looked peaceful with its snow-covered rooftops and charming small-town streets, but beneath that calm exterior lived unspoken tensions. Political disagreements, personal rivalries, cultural divides, and in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, those tensions rarely stayed hidden for long. The Sodders, with their success, their large close-knit family, and George's refusal to bow to anyone's expectations, were not without enemies. Some subtle, some overt, some quiet enough that even the Sodders themselves didn't notice until it was too late. So when the fire came that night, when the smoke rose into the cold December sky, and when 5 children vanished into the darkness without leaving a single trace behind, people whispered. They whispered about the threats George had received. They whispered about the strange men. They whispered about whether the fire was truly an accident, or the beginning of something far more deliberate. And as the embers cooled, the peace of Fayetteville shattered, exposing a truth far more unsettling than anyone had dared to imagine. Christmas Eve of 1945 should have ended like any other holiday night in the Sodder home, full of warmth, noise, and the gentle exhaustion that follows a day spent celebrating. Earlier that evening, the younger children had begged to stay up longer than usual, excited by the glow of the Christmas tree and the promise of morning gifts. Jenny, their mother, finally relented. She trusted them. They were responsible. And besides, it was Christmas. The house was calm by midnight. The older siblings had gone to bed, and Jenny made her rounds, checking the doors, turning off the lights. The last people to see the 5 children alive were Jenny herself and the oldest sister, who had fallen asleep on the couch. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, safe. But in hindsight, signs of something unusual had already started slipping into the night's small disturbances that didn't seem connected at the time. The first came as a sudden, unexpected phone call around 12:30 a.m. When Jenny answered, she heard the noise of a party in the background, clinking glasses, muffled laughter, a woman's voice asking for someone Jenny had never heard of. When Jenny politely told the caller she had the wrong number, the woman let out a strange, almost nervous laugh before hanging up. Jenny dismissed it as a prank, but later she admitted that something about the woman's tone had unsettled her. Then there were the noisy soft thumps on the roof, like something rolling and then stopping abruptly. And outside, through the window, Jenny thought she saw movement in the yard, a silhouette that lingered just a little too long before slipping into the darkness. She tried to shake the unease from her mind. Fayetteville was quiet, but it was still a town full of people. Maybe someone was walking home late. Maybe it was nothing. Even the car parked strangely near the property didn't feel like a threat. At least, not yet. Not yet. The night went still again until just before 1 a.m., when a faint smell reached Jenny's room. Smoke. At first, she wasn't sure. Then she heard a crackling sound, distant but growing. When she sprang from her bed and looked down the hallway, she saw it clearly. Flames blooming from the office room, their glow creeping up the walls like something alive. Within moments, chaos erupted. George and Jenny scrambled to wake the children. The hall filled with smoke, heat pressed forward from the lower floor. They managed to rush some of the kids outside, 4 of them, coughing and terrified, in the cold night air. About 5 were still unaccounted for. Maurice, Martha, Louis, little Jenny, and Betty. George yelled their names, but the house only answered with the roar of fire. He sprinted toward the side yacht, To grab the ladder he always kept propped against the wall. But when he reached the usual spot, it was gone. Vanished. As if someone had moved it. Or taken it. Panic surged in his chest. The older boys tried to start George's trucks, hoping to pull them close to the house to climb up and reach the children's windows, but both trucks, which had worked perfectly the day before, were suddenly dead. The details stacked up like cold, heavy stones. The missing ladder. The disabled trucks. The silent rooms, where the children should have been shouting for help. Inside, the fire grew stronger, swallowing doorways, collapsing beams, forcing George back each time he tried to break through. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was suffocating, and with every passing second, hope slipped further away. He kept trying until the structure weakened so much that the roof began to cave. Jenny held onto him, begging him not to run inside again. The younger children clung to her, crying, shivering in the winter cold. All they could do was watch as their home, full of years of memories, was engulfed in flames. When firefighters finally arrived, the house was reduced to charred wood and smoldering ash. The fire chief shook his head, noting the blaze had burned too hot and too fast. Then came the shocking truth. There were no remains, no bodies, no bones, nothing. 5 children supposedly trapped inside had vanished without a trace. Authorities quickly ruled it an accident, blaming faulty wiring. A tragic, heartbreaking moment. Case closed. But the Sodders were not convinced. The wiring had been inspected recently. The fire hadn't behaved like a typical electrical blaze, and the lack of remains defied everything they understood about house fires. Experts would later confirm that even in extreme heat, bones do not fully disappear without crematorium-level temperatures sustained over long periods. Still, the police refused to reopen the investigation. And then there were the people around town. Not many, but enough to make Jenny uneasy. One neighbor who had been talkative suddenly stopped making eye contact. Another resident gave a statement to police, only to change his story days later. And then there were the ones who acted strangely. Sympathetic to sympathetic, offering condolences with a tone that felt rehearsed, hollow, almost performative. Rumors began spreading. Small comments overheard in stores. Whispers exchanged on porches. People saying things like, maybe those kids weren't in the fire after all. Or, someone was seen driving fast out of town before dawn. The most disturbing twist came from a woman who claimed she had seen the children alive after the fire. She described them in detail, even mentioning the way one girl held another's hand protectively. Her story was dismissed by police, but not by the Sodder. Another witness claimed to see a car speeding out of town at sunrise, with several children in the back seat. Each new account tightened the knot in George and Jenny's hearts. Every inconsistency, every hushed whisper, every strange glance from a neighbor suggested a terrifying possibility. Their children had perished in the fire. They had vanished. And if that were true, someone in Fayetteville might have taken them. Investigators began to wonder, was it merely a house fire, or at the start of something far darker? The truth was now impossible to ignore. By the time the sun rose over the ruins of the Sodder home, the investigation had already started slipping in the wrong direction. The local police surveyed the ashes quickly, declared the fire accidental, and moved on with a certainty that felt disturbingly premature. They blamed faulty wiring, even though the home's electrical system had been inspected recently and pronounced safe. What should have been a meticulous forensic examination became little more than a cursory glance. They did not sift through debris thoroughly. They did not search for bone fragments, personal items, or structural clues. They did not cordon off the scene to protect evidence from contamination. Instead, they allowed the remains of the house to be cleared away within days, making any later investigation nearly impossible. What lingered afterward were only charred impressions in the soil and a silence filled with doubt, faced with official explanations that did not match the reality in front of them. George and Jenny hired a private investigator. This investigator, unlike the local authorities, approached the case with the suspicion it deserved. He interviewed potential suspects, tracked the odd encounters leading up to the fire, and tried to reconstruct the children's last known movements. His findings pointed to alarming inconsistencies, but none were strong enough to force the police into reopening the case. A few suspects were interrogated: a disgruntled worker, a man who had issued strange warnings, a figure who had been seen near the Sodder property days before the fire. But every lead collapsed under the weight of insufficient evidence. Witnesses contradicted one another. Timelines shifted. Alibis emerged from the fog of faulty memory. Step by step, every trail dissolved into dust, leaving the family with more questions than answers. As the investigation faltered, the media descended on Fayetteville, turning the tragedy into a regional spectacle. Newspapers split into two opposing narratives. Some insisted the fire was a tragic accident, framing the Sodders as a grieving family unable to accept their loss. Others leaned toward the darker possibility. The children had been abducted, and the fire had been staged as a distraction. This divide transformed the case into a storm of rhetoric and speculation. Headlines questioned the competence of the fire department. Editorials suggested foul play. Radio hosts debated theories late into the night. Instead of offering clarity, the media amplified confusion, shaping public opinion in unpredictable ways. In the midst of this frenzy, the Sodder family endured a painful duality. On one hand, they were victims' parents, stripped of certainty, haunted by the last voices of their missing children. On the other hand, some treated them as unreliable narrators, people blinded by grief or driven by denial. Rumors accused them of refusing to accept the truth. Others whispered that they were hiding something. The injustice of these suspicions cut deeply. And yet, despite the noise, several theories stood out, each drawing from different fractures in the story. The first theory centered on personal conflict. George Sodder was not subtle in his political opinions, especially about the turmoil in Europe during the 1940s. Some believed that someone who despised his views might have sought revenge. Living in a small Appalachian town where tensions simmered beneath polite interactions, it was not impossible that hostility had taken a darker turn. A grudge, a warning ignored, a threat carried out under the cover of night. The second theory proposed that the fire was a deliberate staged event. In this version, the arson was only the opening act. The real goal was to remove the children from the home, while the blaze created chaos and confusion. The missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the strange figures seen outside all lined up too neatly for a coincidence. If someone wanted to orchestrate a kidnapping without leaving a trail, distracting the family with fire would have provided the perfect opportunity. The third theory suggested the involvement of organized crime or a mysterious third party. Some accounts pointed to figures who had threatened George, previously people tied to business disputes or political organizations. There were whispers that the Sodder children might have been taken as leverage, retaliation, or even by mistake. It was a chilling possibility, one that framed the event not as a random act but as a targeted operation. Each theory had holes, each had fragments of truth, and each pointed toward a different kind of perpetrator. The more investigators tried to align them, the more the narrative fractured. The case refused to settle into a clear shape. At this point, the story becomes less about crime scenes and more about human psychologies. The desire for explanations, the need to assign blame, and the way trauma pushes the mind into tunnels of interpretation. When faced with tragedy, people look for patterns, even in the smallest details. They cling to theories as a way to restore order to a world that has suddenly turned unstable. And so the audience, just like the investigators at the time, is left to confront a difficult question. If he'd were you, standing in the Sodder's place, knowing what they knew, seeing what they saw, what theory would you believe, and why? Would you lean toward personal vengeance, imagining a rival pushed too far? Would you believe in a staged abduction, where every missing object and disabled vehicle becomes part of a coordinated plan? Or would you see the hand of a shadowy third force, someone who knew how to erase footprints and silence witnesses? Each path seems possible. Each path also collapses when pushed too hard. This ambiguity is not a flaw of the investigation, it is the essence of the mystery itself. For weeks, months, and then years, these theories circled each other like restless ghosts, consuming the attention of private investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths. But just when all hope seemed lost, something unexpected emerged, a detail overlooked. A discovery no one anticipated, a clue that did not fit into any established theory, a revelation that would shake the very foundation of the case. Because one day, a discovery surfaced, one that made every existing explanation crumble. when a mystery stretches across decades. Something strange happens. The facts begin to blur into emotions, and the emotions begin to shape the way we interpret the facts. With the Sodder case, the boundaries between truth and shadows have always been thin. To understand what might have happened, we have to step into psychology, human fear, and the unsettling behavior patterns that appear whenever someone wants to erase a family or hide a crime forever. If the Sodder children were abducted, the key question is why. Every crime has a motive, and psychologists generally categorize them into three types: personal resentment, ideological or obsessive beliefs, and unpredictable, impulse-driven behavior. Understanding the motive is essential to making sense of the seemingly senseless. Personal resentment fits the Sodder timeline almost too well. George Sodder was outspoken, especially about politics. In the 1940s, political beliefs could create explosive tensions, especially within immigrant communities, still heavily tied to old-world loyalties. To someone who hated George, hurting his children would have been the ultimate attack and act, not just of violence but domination. It would explain the earlier threats. The strange man warning that his house would burn, and the simmering hostility George had stirred in certain parts of the community. Then there is ideological or political obsession, a different kind of darkness. During World War II and the years after, allegiances were messy. People who disagreed with George's vocal criticism of Mussolini and fascism might have viewed him as an enemy. In this scenario, the crime becomes symbolic a statement, a punishment, or a twisted form of ideological revenge. Psychologists call this mission-based aggression, where the perpetrator believes the harm is justified, even noble. Finally, we have unstable or impulsive offenders, those driven by delusion, thrill-seeking, or psychological fragmentation. In the 1940s, the concept of a serial killer barely existed in public consciousness, yet historically we know many operated undetected. If the Sodder children were taken by someone in this category, their disappearance becomes even more chilling. An act without logic, without personal motive, committed simply because the opportunity existed. This is where philosophy comes into play. Stoic wisdom teaches that people are frightened not by things themselves, but by how unfamiliar they seem. The unknown unsettles us, because it lies beyond our control. For the Sodders, the absence of answers became a mental prison. In that void, imagination takes over, and often it conjures fears far darker than reality. Decades later, modern behavioral profiling offers fresh perspectives on the scattered clues left behind. By analyzing patterns of human behavior and criminal psychology, investigators can reinterpret the fragments of evidence, uncovering possibilities that were previously overlooked. The mystery endures, but our understanding of it continues to evolve. Take the missing ladder. It wasn't simply misplaced, it was moved from the house entirely. That suggests planning, not accident. Someone likely wanted to remove tools the family could use to save the children or investigate the fire. Then there were the trucks that refused to start. Sabotage is a tactic offenders use when they expect resistance. If the goal was to take the children alive, disabling escape vehicles would be crucial. And the eyewitness sightings: women at a Charleston hotel claiming they saw the children. A waitress who swore she served them breakfast. A man in Florida who believed he'd seen them living with strangers. Those cannot be ignored. Even if half were mistaken, the consistency is unnerving. The children appeared to be alive, traveling, hidden. Modern profilers note that this pattern aligns with organized criminal groups operating in the mid-20th century, groups that specialized in abduction, coercion, and human trafficking. Long before such terms became part of our legal vocabulary, in parts of the country in the 1940s, organized crime had far more reach than law enforcement. Another possibility, rare but plausible, is the involvement of a serial offender. The 1940s had multiple unsolved child disappearances across several states. Some historians have even suggested connections between these cases, including the Sodder children. If true, this transforms the tragedy from a targeted act into part of a wider pattern of predatory behavior. The fire might then have been a cover, not a cause. A smokescreen, literal and metaphorical, to hide a kidnapping that required minutes of chaos and distraction. For the Sodder family, the consequences were lifelong. They existed in a liminal space, somewhere between grief and hope, mourning and denial. Psychologists refer to this as ambiguous loss, The kind of trauma that never fully heals, because there is no closure. A death without a body is a wound without a scar. They rebuilt their lives, physically constructing a memorial billboard, launching independent investigations, but emotionally, they remained frozen in the same night for decades. Every rumor sparked new hope. Every hoax reopened the wound. Every false lead was both a gift and a curse. Even the town of Fayetteville felt the strain. The case divided neighbors, sparked arguments, and created distrust toward the police. Some believed the family's theories, others accused them of refusing to accept tragedy, and the police, criticized for negligence, struggled under the suspicion that they had mishandled or even intentionally ignored key evidence. In small towns, reputations are delicate, and the Sodder mystery left deep, lasting scars on everyone who experienced it. Decades later, the answers remain frustratingly out of reach. Every theory seems incomplete. Every clue only leads to more questions. The case exists at the uneasy intersection of logic and instinct, evidence and intuition, reason and fear. Perhaps that is why it continues to captivate us. Challenges the very limits of what we can know or prove. Even now, we are left staring into the shadows of uncertainty, wondering what truly happened that night. As we end this chapter, one haunting question remains. Can truth ever be fully revealed in the light? Or does it dwell forever in the shadows, just beyond our courage to confront it? The Sodder mystery reminds us that some answers may always elude us, lingering in uncertainty. The tale of the 5 missing Sodder children is more than a story of disappearance. It reflects one of humanity's deepest fears. That truth can remain forever out of reach. In this case, fear becomes a mirror, showing only gaps, shadows, and unanswered questions. Every clue, every odd detail, becomes magnified in its absence. The mystery reminds us to pay attention to the small, easily overlooked signs. Often, these subtle pieces hold the key to understanding what we cannot immediately see. In the end, the Sodder case endures because it forces us to confront uncertainty and the limits of our knowledge, leaving us haunted yet vigilant. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe for more. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcasts.